Now, for this evening's presentation. Obviously, you're in for a big treat. Our speaker, Janet Uhlar, is a Cape Cod resident who was a juror in the Whitey Bulger case. As she states, it was not Bulger's criminology that affected her deeply. And so she'll tell you about that. It was the government and all the workings around the case that were of interest. Ms. Uhlar has authored 2 books on forgotten heroes of the American Revolution. Dr. Joseph Warren, which she told me this evening is no relationship to our girl Mercy Otis, and General Nathaniel Greene, Liberty's Martyrs and Freedom's Cost, respectively. And she's been a well-received speaker here before. Janet is on the board of trustees of the Nathaniel Greene Homestead and on the advisory board of the Mulberry Grove Foundation and the General Nathaniel Greene Monument Foundations. Her lectures on Nathaniel Greene and Joseph Warren have inspired the Valley Forge Monument Project, completed in August 2015 by the General Sons of the Revolution in South Boston, the Warren Sash Project, which is ongoing in Coventry, Rhode Island, and she is currently at work, at least technically, on a John Hancock biography. However, she's also compiling the letters from Whitey Bulger, which ought to be very interesting. So, without further ado, I do like to welcome our tonight's speaker, Janet Uhlar.
Thank you. One sip of water. Yep, I was on the jury. Ignorance is not bliss, folks, okay? I knew nothing going into it. I was the perfect juror, as some say, a blank slate. I lived outside of, even though I was born and raised in Massachusetts, I lived outside of Massachusetts for the 30 years that Bulger was active, and I had no interest whatsoever in organized crime. Folks, I'm going to confess to you, I never even read The Godfather or watched the movie, okay? Ignorance is not bliss. Going into the trial, I knew nothing except the name, Whitey Bulger. I heard he was an Irish mob boss. That's all I knew. I didn't know any of the people associated with him. So you can imagine sitting in that jury trying to follow the story because the attorneys were not kind enough to me to go in chronological order. They jumped from the 90s to the 70s, back to the 90s, into the 80s, and threw out names that everybody seemed to know who they were talking about, except me, okay? So, now let's see if I can figure this out again. I was shown, but I'm not good at this stuff. Okay, we all know this iconic picture. It's one of those pictures that you almost remember where you were when you saw it. I remember I was at work as pediatric nurse, private duty, and I was sitting with the mother of the child I took care of, and this came on the news, and we both agreed, you know, basically, why doesn't he just die and get it over with? And, you know, that's what our conversation was. Little did I know what was going to happen to me. Now, the story that all of us know about Whitey Bulger. Now, folks, the name Whitey was given to him by the police in South Boston because when he was young, his hair was so blonde, it looked white. He hated being called Whitey, so I might refer to him at times as Jim rather than Whitey, okay? The story, and I will tell you, and maybe by the end of this you'll agree with me, the myth began with a bunch of books that were written and with a bunch of newspaper articles that were written. Here we have a book, Kevin Weeks, Kevin Cullen, Shelley Murphy, Lear and O'Neill. They were Globe reporters. Kevin Weeks was also a criminal. Uh-oh. There we go. And the tale is further spun by a Boston Herald journalist who wrote the books Rifleman and Hitman. Now, I'm sure many of you in the audience have read these two books, and I can't say for a fact about Rifleman, but I can tell you Hitman, according to the testimony of John Materano, who the book is about, he partnered with Howie Carr to write the book, and he got half the royalties. According to Materano's testimony, at the time of the Bulger trial, John Materano had earned $70,000 off that book. And I was disgusted because I realized that everybody who purchased that book had no idea that they were actually supporting Johnny Materano. Now, these are some of the key players in the trial. This was referred to as the dream team by the Boston Globe, okay? These are the federal prosecutors. Front and center is Fred Wyshak, who has been involved in everything Bulger for 30 years, okay? And over, I have a thing here somewhere. There, him. His name is Brian Kelly, and this young guy is Zach. Zach was very new, just his baptism in fire type of thing, I think. But got to know these guys pretty well because every time they got upset, you could tell they were upset because they had different mannerisms about them. And some of them were kind of gross. One of them would lick, I'm not kidding you, he'd lick his finger, rub his hand, again and again and again. It's like, oh my gosh, I guess he's upset. And all the jury knew it. I mean, you just sit there and stare at them. What are you going to do, you know? Also, another way you knew they were upset is all the objections. Sometimes it was like Jack in the Box. Objection, 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 objection. And the judge sidebar. And we'd get ushered out, and you knew that was something important that you probably weren't going to hear about when you came back, okay? And these were the defense attorneys. And I have to tell you, you couldn't read these guys. You couldn't read them. That's the difference between a prosecuting attorney and a defense attorney, I guess. If you are ever in trouble, okay, I'm telling you right now, you want to hire this guy. And if you are ever a witness and he's going to cross-examine you, watch out. When we were first introduced to these guys, he appeared very, very timid. That's Hank Brennan and Jay Kearney. And Hank seemed very timid. He was objecting to something. You could barely hear him. Objection, objection. And I'm sitting there thinking, this guy's going to get eaten up and spit out. This must be his first case. But when he got up to cross-examine witnesses, oh my God, the jury loved him. He kept us awake. We were always very excited when he was getting up. Not that Jay was bad, but Hank is amazing. I'm telling you, write that name down in case you're ever in trouble, okay? Now, my background, as was said, is that I write books about the American Revolution. I had already written 2 books at the time of this trial. I had an understanding of the principles of our judicial system as in the foundation of our country. And I had also been involved in a case, a wrongful death suit. One of my sons had passed, and we went to court for that. And I knew what happened to a jury, that a jury often misses a lot of facts because, as I said to you earlier, they're ushered out of the courtroom, and when they come back, that subject isn't discussed again. So I had a knowledge of this. Now, I also knew that when the defense attorney gets up and says in his opening statement that his client is guilty of most of the charges, that there's something really wrong. Okay? I mean, he said that, and I sat there and I said, what the heck are we doing here? Okay? No background about Bulger. This guy is basically telling us we need to find him guilty on the first day, and I was paying attention. because I knew. I looked over at Hank Brennan and Bulger, and they were just sitting there as if nothing was said. And I thought, oh my God, what's happening? Here are some more characters from the trial. Stevie Fleming, Johnny Materano, Kevin Weeks, and the most despicable of all, John Morris. I refer to them as the fraudulent four. Jim Bulger called them the cooperating killers, okay? We're going to start with the one I consider the most despicable. Now I have to change my glasses so I can read this to you. John Morris, he was a supervisor of the FBI's organized crime squad. And his hands are covered in blood. He was taking money not only from Bulger, but from two other organized crime figures, okay? And things were closing in on him. He was getting found out. So what he did was jump the gun there before they arrested and threw him into prison, and he confessed to numerous federal crimes committed while working for the FBI, including but not limited to being an accessory in 2 murders. I want that to sink in, folks. He admitted he was an accessory in 2 murders while working for the FBI. And those 2 murders we'll talk about in a little bit. He took bribes, as I said, from 3 criminals in exchange for information. And he went to the Boston Globe reporters when things were closing in on him and he thought he was going to get arrested. And he told the Boston Globe reporters that Whitey Bulger was an FBI informant. And the plan was, according to one of the judges in Boston that laid into him and the Boston Globe reporters after the fact, that they intended, or he intended, to have Bulger murdered by the mafia or members of his own gang by giving that story to the Globe. Okay? He was given immunity from prosecution through Assistant U.S. Attorney Fred Wyshak, the one that was front and center there, for his testimony against FBI Special Agent John Connolly and James Whitey Bulger. There was no indictment or time served. He remained in the FBI. He was promoted and exalted within the FBI and retired with a full pension that you and I are paying, folks. He actually retired out of Quantico. He now lives in a normal neighborhood among hard-working families. Do you know who your neighbors are? This man gave information to Bulger that he knew would lead to the death of the people he was giving the information about. He confessed to 2 of them. Bulger claimed there were many, many more. He never left the FBI. And the prosecuting attorneys, after his first day of testimony, because it was so difficult for him, one of them walked out with his arm across his shoulders. I'm not kidding you, folks. These were the 2 murders he confessed to being an accessory in. Brian Halloran. Now, Brian Halloran's an interesting case. He wanted to be an FBI informant. He wanted to inform against Whitey Bulger. But there was a problem. You can't have 2 informants supposedly informing on each other. So those within the FBI, meaning John Morris and John Connolly, who claimed to be Bulger's handlers, they decided that this guy couldn't be protected. So this guy had to be let out of witness protection. Well, we'll talk about the FBI agent later who tried to protect the life of Brian Halloran, who never got a pension from the FBI, by the way, like John Morris did, okay? And so he was cut loose. William Weld had a part in cutting him loose as well. That was in the testimony, that they went to William Weld at the time and asked him to protect Brian Halloran, and Weld said, no, cut him loose. And so nobody would protect him. He was cut loose, and within a couple days, he was killed. He was with his friend, oops. He was with his friend, wrong one, Michael Donahue, who happened to just be at the wrong place at the wrong time, and Bulger killed the two of them. Now, it was brought up in court because there was a second shooter and nobody ever identified the second shooter. It was always a mystery, and it was revealed that the second shooter was a man named Pat Nee. Perhaps you've heard of him. We'll talk about him in a little while. Well, one of the times the jury was taken out of the courtroom, I guess Pat Nee came in with his attorney, and he claimed the fifth, wouldn't answer any questions about all the murders he was tied into, and he was never indicted for any of them. Okay? Oh gosh, guys. Okay. Over here is, they talked about the FBI informant file on Bulger for 10 days. 10 days we talked about it. And it was interesting because the jury felt certainly we're going to have some decisions to make about this informant file. But lo and behold, when we got in to deliberate, there was absolutely nothing, zilch, nothing about the informant file that we had to discuss. It was all done for the media or whatever, I don't know. But I will tell you this, just in the testimony on that informant file, I had already come to the conclusion that Whitey Bulger was not an FBI informant. Okay? The file was all wrong. That's what they showed us in court. The front page was missing all kinds of information, including a mugshot and fingerprints. It was like no other informant file. And things from this informant file that was supposed to be on Bulger, other FBI agents came in and testified that things were lifted from their informant files. Dates changed, names changed, and put into Bulger's verbatim. 4 FBI agents testified to this, and that they saw John Connolly going into their informant files on a regular basis. That was my conclusion. Now again, I told you that the way we discovered that Bulger was an informant was from this man, who never suffered any punishment whatsoever. Do you think maybe he could be a liar? Johnny Martorano. What an interesting character. Again, I didn't know these guys. And when he walked into the courtroom, I'll never forget it, there's hush fell over the courtroom. It was like, oh my God, who is this, you know? Everybody was holding their breath. He was followed by a bunch of people. I don't know if they were buddies of his or attorneys of his or bodyguards. I have no idea. But anyway, Johnny would talk about the murders he committed as though he was swatting a mosquito. No emotion whatsoever. He was arrested in 1995. He confessed to 20 murders, which included many innocents who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. 2 such victims were teens, 1 a woman. He confessed to numerous federal crimes. The proffer or the agreement he received with the Boston U.S. Attorney's Office was made with, again, Assistant U.S. Attorney Fred Wyshak. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for 20 cold-blooded murders. Do the math, folks. It's less than 6 months for every murder. Now, when Johnny was testifying, got to tell you, he was talking about how Assistant U.S. Attorney Wyshak would come to him in prison and basically say to him, give us substantial information against Bulger and we'll make a deal. And Johnny would give some information. And the U.S. Attorney would say, not good enough. Now, John was facing the electric chair in Florida and Oklahoma for 2 of the murders he committed. So basically, the assistant U.S. attorney would say, not good enough, you're going to fry, okay? And John told us that this happened 4 times, where the assistant U.S. attorney came to him looking for better information. Well, finally, John managed to give him enough information that he was satisfied. And then he got his deal, less than 6 months for every cold-blooded murder. Okay? And then not only that, but John was given money while in prison so he could buy whatever he might need or want. By you and me, we gave him that money, the taxpayers, all right? Then when he left prison, when he left prison and passed go, he was handed $20,000 from us. Wasn't that nice? Huh? He was allowed to make a profit off his story, and he did not need to make restitution to anyone. That was a judgment from the court. And he did, as I told you. At the time of the trial, he made $70,000 off his story, and I'm sure it's doubled by now with the movie Black Mass coming out and all that stuff, right? He also told us in court that he had received $250,000 for movie rights, and that if a movie was made, he'd get even more. Now, John, he's receiving Social Security, okay, along with all this other stuff. He lives in a normal neighborhood among hard-working neighbors. Do you know who your neighbors are? Now, if you're a sex offender, you have to sign up, right? So everybody knows. If you're a serial killer, folks, you don't. Can't make this stuff up. These are 2 of the people that Martirano killed. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Elizabeth Dixon was 19 years old, and Douglas Barrett was 17 years old. When he described their murder, again, no emotion, and he didn't mean to kill them. It was an accident, you know. But then when Hank Brennan got up, the defense attorney, and pointed out that both of them were shot with 1 bullet in the back of the head, yeah, I don't think so. They were murdered by John Martirano on January 6, 1968. Elizabeth and Douglas existed, and their young lives mattered. He served less than 6 months for each of their murders. What about them, and what about their families? Steve Fleming, another darling, okay? He was also arrested in 1995, but Fleming made a mistake. You see, Johnny Martirano knew enough to jump on the wagon to try to get a deal, okay? And he was the first one to spill his guts for that deal. Well, Steve Fleming wasn't so quick because, you see, Steve Fleming was an FBI informant. He admitted that he became an FBI informant in 1965, all right? And he was giving all kinds of information to the FBI, including a map of where the mafia held their induction ceremony, because he had been in that room, so he knew how the room was set up. And that is how the government got the mafia in Boston, from that map, okay? They put wires in the room, and that's how it happened. Well, so Stevie Fleming thinks, okay, I'm an FBI informant, so I don't have to do anything. They're going to protect me. I'm not going to really go to prison for very long. Well, Steve was wrong. They didn't hold up their end of the bargain, darn it, okay? So he confessed to 10 murders, including 2 women. He confessed to numerous federal crimes. He admitted, again, to being an FBI agent, informant. He did make a proffer with, again, the assistant U.S. attorney, Fred Wyshak. He was sentenced, because he waited so long, to life in a federal club fed. Do you guys know what a club fed is? It's a luxury place. I mean, they read the menu for what these guys eat, and it sounded like maybe one of Donald Trump's hotels, their restaurant menu, okay? He was returned at least $2 million in tainted assets by the government while he was serving life at the Club Fed. This was all testimony. I'm not making this stuff up, guys. Actually, the jury couldn't figure out, because the testimony was so quick with the tax attorney talking about this, it was anywhere between $2 and $7 million, as near as we could figure, that was returned to Steve Flemmi while he was serving life, all in tainted assets. Why does he need $2 to $7 million if he's serving life in prison? He could also make a profit off his story without any restitution to the victims. And he also wrote his book with Howie Carr. He was offered a Rule 35 motion for testimony in Bulger's trial. This was brought up by one of the defense attorneys, and objection, Your Honor, objection, objection, jury's taken out. We come back in. And the attorney is allowed to tell us what that means, a Rule 35 motion. Well, basically what it means is that when he was arrested initially, he was told that if he would give testimony that would help the Boston U.S. attorneys to incarcerate whomever they wanted to incarcerate, if Flemmi had a tie to them, including Bulger, including Connolly. And if you remember last summer, there was a big trial in Boston, a mafia guy by the name of Cadillac Frank Salemi. Well, Steve Flemmi testified against that Salemi as well. And basically, if he helped them incarcerate these people, then time would be taken off his sentence. A life sentence. How does that work, one wonders? I don't know. So following Bulger's trial, Flemmi was no longer listed within the federal prison system. Surprise, surprise. He was recently connected to a cold case in Rhode Island. That was last summer's trial with Cadillac Salemi. He now lives somewhere in witness protection with $2 to $7 million in a normal neighborhood. Do you know who your neighbors are? Now let's talk about some of this guy's murders. Debbie Davis was his girlfriend. Davis was 17 when they met. Flemmi was 37. Okay, when they're given this testimony, I'm sitting there thinking, where were her parents? What the heck was going on in this family to allow this? Well, we found out that her father did object to Debbie's relationship with Flemmi, and the father was found dead shortly thereafter. You see, Deborah brought home a fancy sports car, and her father didn't like it. Flemmi had given it to her, and her father went out and beat in the windshield with a bat or something. Yeah, he died for that. She received expensive gifts from Flemmi. They were together for about 7 years. She would be sent on trips. Flemmi would allow her to go on these exotic trips, often with her mother, and he didn't go. And on one of these trips, Deborah fell in love with another guy. Okay, she came back and she set up this elaborate system because she was living with Flemmi. So she would go over to her mother's home, and her lover would call her there at a certain time. Well, she didn't know that Flemmi suspected something, and he tapped the phone at her mother's house, okay? Deborah was supposed to fly out one day to go be with her lover and marry him. Flemmi got wind of it, obviously. He asked Deborah to meet him at a home he was going to purchase for her parents, and she was never seen after that meeting. It was later learned that Deborah was killed at that house. Flemmi pulled out her teeth, stripped her of her clothing, because that's what he did. Okay? Now, Bulger was charged with this murder, and Flemmi said Bulger did it. Bulger always denied he killed Debbie. In fact, he told me in many letters how much he liked Debbie. But she became the material girl after meeting Steve. And he said it was a crime of passion when Steve found out that she was running off, and he didn't know about the murder till after the fact. I don't know. We do know that John Materano asked Flemmy once what happened to Deborah, and Steve Flemmy told John Materano that he accidentally strangled her. That he accidentally strangled her. Nothing about Bulger. Olga Davis, this is Deborah's mother. She accepted Deborah's relationship, along with the many gifts she personally received from Flemmy. The mother personally sought the help of the FBI to find Deborah when she went missing. Now, these FBI agents testified in the trial about Olga Davis coming to them. And they said she came about 8 times, and they were trying to figure out, where she could be. But Olga told them that she believed that Flemmy killed her husband and her daughter. That's what she believed at that time. Then the 8th time Olga came in to talk to them, she said that they probably would never find Debbie, but could they please find her white fur coat? That was in testimony. So they refused to see her again after that. Debbie's younger sister began dating Flemmy, and gifts continued to come from Flemmy. The younger sister supposedly took her life shortly thereafter. Supposedly. This is another one of Flemmy's murders, Debbie Hussey. She was 26 years old, murdered in January of 1985. Debbie was the stepdaughter of Steve Flemmy. Her mother moved in with him when Debbie was 2 years old. And at first, it was a nice little father-daughter relationship. She referred to him as Daddy. And he'd sit her on his lap and read her bedtime stories, tuck her in at night. Then when she became a teenager, he started sexually abusing her. And Debbie told her mother. And the mother believed her and threw Flemmy out, but then she brought Flemmy back in. And again, he's abusing Debbie. So Debbie moved out, and she's trying to survive on the streets. And she ended up prostituting herself to survive. And she ended up involved in drugs. And Flemmy would send her away a few times. And she'd always find her way back to Boston, because Boston was her home. And she survived in the only way she knew to survive. Well, that was becoming a problem, folks, So Debbie disappeared. Now, from the innocent age of 2, when Stephen Flemmy became her stepfather, Debbie didn't stand a chance. Again, testimony. Flemmy wants us to think that Bulger killed Debbie Davis. I'm sorry, Debbie Hussey. But Kevin Weeks wouldn't identify who did it. He said he was upstairs in the bathroom, came down, heard a thud, and they were just both standing there. He didn't see who did what. But then Flemmy took her body down to the basement to bury it and to pull out her teeth and take off her clothing, because that's what he did. And according to Kevin Weeks, she was still alive, and Flemmy strangled her again. So here's Kevin Weeks, we see over here, okay? He was an accessory in 5 murders. He got 5 years. He made a deal also. Now, this is an interesting character. Remember Pat Nee? Remember I told you he was identified in that murder and claimed the 5th and was never indicted. He was also identified in 5 other murders. Never indicted, okay? He was arrested in 1987 for smuggling 7.5 tons of armaments to the IRA. The statutory sentence for this federal crime was life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. Nee served only 18 months. He was arrested again in 1990 in an armored car robbery. Nee was masked and in possession of a machine gun, which carried a mandatory life sentence. No possibility of parole. Nee served only 8 years. His release was unopposed and never explained by the Boston U.S. Attorney's Office. He was named as an accessory, as I said, in 5 murders. He had a reality show, maybe you guys have seen it, on the Discovery Channel called Sainthoods, about his activity in sports gambling before sports gambling was legal. It was obvious, nobody arrested him, okay? He now lives in a normal neighborhood among hardworking neighbors. This was a name that got mentioned twice in the trial. And it was one of those names that really caused a problem. Objection, 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 sidebar, out of the courtroom, jury. And it was never mentioned when we came back in. So I remembered this name. And I determined that when the trial was over, I was going to try to figure out who this person was. After the trial, I got in touch with Bulger's attorneys, and Jay Carney said, meet me in Boston, we'll have lunch. This was probably a week after the trial, after the verdict was in. And from the moment we sat down, he didn't stop talking, and I wish to God I had taped it. One of the first things he told me, which the jury had no information of, was that when Bulger was arrested in California, he offered to plead guilty to all charges and accept the death penalty with no appeal. What he wanted in exchange for that was leniency for his girlfriend, Catherine Gregg. Now, it came out in testimony that the probation department suggested Catherine serve 2 years in prison because she had no priors. Her guilt was falling in love with Bulger and living with him for 16 years. That, folks, would have been leniency. But the Boston U.S. Attorney's Office denied his offer to plead guilty and accept the death penalty, and instead insisted on a trial that cost you and me millions of dollars. Now, the jury wasn't told that. I found that out from Jay Carney. Jay Carney also told me about Jeremiah O'Sullivan. He was the head of the New England Organized Crime Strike Force, a branch of the Department of Justice that brought down the Boston Mafia boss. Now, I told you they tapped that room that Flemmy gave them a map to, the induction room, and that's how they found out where to find these guys. Jeremiah O'Sullivan was very involved in that. He was later a U.S. attorney for Massachusetts. He sought Bulger out through a priest to ask Bulger for protection for himself and his family from mafia retaliation. He offered Bulger protection in exchange. Evidence indicates that O'Sullivan held up to his end of the agreement. I got to tell you, folks, I talked to a former DA who was also after Bulger, and he told me he hired guards to protect him and his family from the mafia. So this was going on. I also talked to an FBI agent, former FBI agent, and I mentioned this to him. He said, well, why didn't he just come to the FBI for protection? And I just looked at him and laughed. I said, really? Margaret McLean, a law professor at Boston College and legal analyst, found a reference from a 2004 Congressional Committee on Government Reform to a 1979 memo by O'Sullivan concerning Bulger. This memo was sealed under executive order under George W. Bush. O'Sullivan died in 2009. Bulger was found less than 2 years later, having lived for many of those years only 3 miles from FBI headquarters in Los Angeles. 3 miles, guys. Sullivan dies, and all of a sudden, oh, we can go get him now. I don't know, maybe. This is the FBI agent who tried to protect Brian Halloran, the one that they wanted to cut loose. His name's Bob Fitzpatrick. He testified, and his testimony was fascinating. He said that he came to the Boston office. He already had 20 plus years under his belt, and he was second in charge in the Boston office. And he was over John Morris and John Connolly, who were claiming they were the handlers of Bulger, who was an FBI informant. So Bob Fitzpatrick said in his testimony that he wanted to talk to Bulger. And so they made arrangements for him to talk to Bulger. I asked Bulger why in the world would he want to talk to Bob Fitzpatrick, who was an honest FBI agent, and he said there was always the potential and the hope that he could corrupt him. Okay? So, he was honest. So Bob went and he said he asked Bulger questions. And when he left with John Morris, he told John Morris that Bulger did not answer any of the questions properly for an FBI informant. And then he needed to be taken off as an informant and made a target. He reported this to the special agent in charge the next day and gave him the memo that he had written up about it, and the special agent in charge had it put in his office safe, saying that he was going to send it to Quantico. It never got to Quantico. So Bob Fitzpatrick wondered why Bulger wasn't being made a target, so he actually called Quantico to see, why they weren't responding to it, and they told him to mind his business. So things got kind of sketchy in the Boston office after that, and he decided he wanted to transfer out. So his wife, Linda, was pregnant at the time and having difficulty in her pregnancy, and he did not want to move very far from Boston. So he asked to be sent to Providence, Rhode Island. There was an opening, and he would have to take a downgrade, okay, in his federal pay. And he was willing to do that. And he went to Providence, and guess what? It was worse than Boston. The corruption within that office. So he opted to retire early, and he never got his pension. He never got his pension. Okay? Now, let me jump ahead. Following his testimony, a woman by the name of Desi Soteropoulos came in to testify, and she had been the secretary to the special agent in charge of the FBI in Boston for decades. I think it was like 40 decades. Desi was probably about 90 years old when she came in to testify. And she indeed testified to the fact that Bob Fitzpatrick did write up this memo to make Bulger a target, and it was put in the safe. And she was told by the special agent in charge, who originally put that in the safe, to make sure that every special agent in charge that came after him read that memo and put it back in the safe. And she did that. 1, 2, and then the third one told her to destroy it or they would all be in trouble. So she destroyed the original memo, but lo and behold, there was a copy. So she claimed his testimony was true. Following the trial, Bob Fitzpatrick was arrested by none other than Fred Wyshak and charged with perjury and obstruction of justice. Nothing to do with his testimony about Bulger, but other things he said. They said he exaggerated things and blah, 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 blah. And rather than go through a whole trial, Bob Fitzpatrick, he was very ill man, and he ended up getting probation for 2 years. Not only no pension, folks, but harassed for his testimony, which was corroborated by Desi Soteropoulos. Here's another interesting witness, Ralph DeMasi. Ralph was my hero, I gotta tell you, okay? And I've been in touch with, as you get to Bob Fitzpatrick, and I got in touch with Ralph after the trial. Ralph came in as he was supposed to be a witness for the prosecution. And the first thing he said was that he was there under duress. Objection, objection, objection. The prosecutors are objecting at their own witness's testimony. It was really interesting. So we got sent out, came back, Ralph was still there, and he was told that he could explain why he was under duress. And Ralph went on to tell us that he had just spent 22 years in prison for a conspiracy to commit a robbery. I want you to hear that word again. Conspiracy. Didn't commit the robbery, okay? So he served 22 years, and he told the jury that in that time he saw many, many prisoners let out because they gave testimony against other prisoners. And he talked about how horrific it was that serial killers were being let out of jail on a regular basis because they would testify against other people. So he blasted the DOJ for this. Now, after the trial, in 2016, December, I remember I was vacuuming my rug in the living room, and the news was on, and they said, let me tell you this too. Ralph was in a car with another guy. This is why they called him in to testify. And the car he was in was shot at by another car, and Ralph was shot 9 times, and the other guy, William O'Brien, was killed. Now, Ralph testified that he only knew one person that was in that car. There were 3 men in the car. He could only identify one, a man named Tommy King, because he saw him get in the car. He had no idea who the other 2 men were at the time. Well, they wanted him to say that one of the men was Bulger, and Ralph refused to do that. He said, I've never laid eyes on Bulger before today. I couldn't see the other person in the car, so I can't tell you it's Bulger, okay? So that particular murder, the jury acquitted Bulger of because there was absolutely nothing to pin it to him, okay? So after the trial, Ralph's on the news. He's arrested for a cold case murder, a 25-year-old cold case murder. And the reporter goes on to tell us that Ralph had testified in the trial of Bulger, and Ralph said that he had been shot 9 times by Bulger. And I'm watching this TV and I'm saying, no, he didn't. No, he didn't say that. So I actually called the news stations after and I said, he didn't say that. Nobody paid attention. So anyway, Ralph's in prison for 2 years. It seems these 2 prisoners came forward. One claimed that he was driving the getaway car when this murder took place, so he knew Ralph did it, okay? He was given a really good deal. He got out of prison for saying that, okay? Then another one said that Ralph told him in prison that he did it. He got out of prison for saying that too. And so I called Ralph's attorneys. Now, you know, maybe, I don't know, maybe Ralph did it. I went to meet Ralph, and Ralph's focus after getting out of prison for 22 years was his family and also writing articles for the newspaper. And his articles, he would send them to me so I could read them and correct them maybe. And they were on starting a National First Responders Day. They were on starting anger management classes in kindergarten and throughout public school. They were on bringing back the death penalty. That was an interesting one. These were the things he was writing about, okay? So I called his attorney and I said, I don't know if you know about Ralph's testimony in the Bulger case, but I suggest that you get a copy, a transcript of it. And the attorney told me later that he did indeed get a transcript of it, and his focus in the trial was going to be that these prisoners that testified against him were lying because of the deals they got. You might say anything if you're going to get out of prison. That's what half the Bulger jury believed about Materano, Fleming, Weeks, and Morris, that they'd lie to get out of prison. We wouldn't take any of their testimony unless it was corroborated with something else, okay? So Ralph served 2 years, finally went to trial. It was a 5-day trial. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and acquitted him of all charges. They saw right through what had happened. I hear noise. John Connolly and John Morris, corrupt FBI agents. But why is Connolly in prison and not Morris? Now, to this day, John Connolly, won't admit that the FBI informant file was phony. But he also, I write to him, but he also said that be secure in the fact that when I am set free, the whole unvarnished truth will come out. So why? Why did Morris get away and Connolly didn't? Because Connolly said he would tell the truth as they were dragging him through trials. He said he was going to reveal what happened within the FBI. Now, according to Bulger, he told me that he had given about $500,000 to each of these men for information that often led to the murders of individuals, that these two men knew, giving the information that these individuals would in fact die, okay? That sometimes he would get, he said John Connolly gave him a gift once for Christmas. It was wrapped in Christmas paper. It weighed about 65 pounds, and it had a loud explosion to it. A bomb? He never really specified. He just said, ask John about that gift. Okay? I don't know. Believe what you want. I'm just kind of telling you what I think I know. Catherine Gregg. We talked about her already, that Bulger was going to accept the death penalty for leniency for Catherine. They didn't give leniency to Catherine. They threw 11 years on her, ultimately, the first year in solitary confinement. Again, Catherine had no priors. Catherine was a dental hygienist, and she taught dental hygiene. She had committed no crimes. Now, Johnny Materano's girlfriend testified in the Bulger trial. Her name was Patricia, I spelled that wrong, Patricia Lytle. And Patricia was only 17 when she ran off with Johnny to Florida. Johnny was on the lam. I know all the lingo, folks, all of it, okay? So she testified, Patricia did, that Johnny would have her fly up to Boston numerous times, and she would collect money. Sometimes somebody would be right there at the airport, should take the envelope filled with large amounts of cash and turn around and get on another plane and go back. Or sometimes she'd go to her mother's house and the money would be waiting for her there. That's called money laundering. Okay? Patricia also lied to a grand jury. That's a crime. Catherine Gregg is serving 11 years. You know how long Patricia served? Nothing. Nothing. Now we're going to get into some interesting stuff. That was nothing what I told you already. When Jim Bulger started writing to me, and believe me, he didn't trust me at first. His first letter back to me said, I don't trust police, lawyers, judges, or jurors. So it was like, okay, how do so my next letter to him was about nothing except things we might have in common, both coming from large Catholic families, growing up in a housing project, this type of thing. And it was through that kind of, back and forth that he came to trust me. But his letters, he always would put the time of day on his letter, along with the date, and it was all often 1, 2, 3 in the morning. And so I wrote to him early on, and I said, why do you write at that time? And his response was, ever since MK Ultra, I hallucinate at night. I can only sleep a couple of hours, and I wake up thinking there are wild animals in the room. And I looked at that and I thought, what the heck is MK Ultra? This guy's nuts. Never heard of it. Anybody here ever heard of it? You're going to be hearing a lot more about it, believe me. So I started to look into it. And I found that there was actually a Senate hearing in 1977 about it, and there was lots of information out there about it. Basically, it was a project done by the CIA in the 1950s and 60s in which they were testing LSD on individuals without their full knowledge or consent. Now, Bulger at first didn't remember a whole lot about it. I was giving him more information. He didn't know about it. He never used it as a defense in his trial. It was never brought up ever in his trial. He did not believe that there were any effects from it except for the fact that for 60 years he hallucinated every night, okay? Now, as we talked about it, he would tell me that he remembered being hooked up to big machines, and the doctor would ask him questions when he was hooked up to the machines. He didn't know that, I don't even know if I found that picture then or if I found it later, but he didn't know I had seen that picture at the time. This is just one page from a hospital prison record, his record. And from this page, we see that he was given high doses of LSD twice a week, and it lasted for 18 months. Bulger was 26 years old when this started. He was serving in Atlanta Federal Prison for robbery at the time. He had never killed anyone at this point. They came in often, he said, and they would ask the prisoners if they wanted to volunteer for experiments. He said before this one, he had volunteered for one for whooping cough. And he said that often the prisoners would like to do this because they felt like they were part of society in doing it. So they came in and they told 9 guys that they were going to do an experiment to find a cure for schizophrenia. So these guys signed up to do this experiment. Project MKUltra, the CIA's program of research in behavioral modification. That's what the US Senate hearing says about it. That was the purpose of MKUltra, to modify behavior with the use of LSD. Now, the CIA, when they got found out in the mid-60s, thought they destroyed all the records, but there were a few that they missed in some strange office in the Pentagon. And it was when those were discovered that the Senate had their hearing. Now, as you can see, it was Wednesday, August 3rd, the hearing, 1977. U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research of the Committee on Human Resources. Admiral Turner was one of the CIA representatives at the time. And he said, what we are here to do is to give you all the information that we now have and which we did not previously have on a subject known as Project MKUltra, a project which took place from 1953 to 1964. It was an umbrella project under which there were numerous sub-projects for research, among other things, on drugs and behavioral modification. Admiral Turner. There are also names of 80 institutions where work was done or with which these people were affiliated. The institutions include 44 colleges, 15 research foundation or chemical or pharmaceutical companies or the like, 12 hospitals. Now remember, folks, nobody had knowledge or gave their consent to be experimented on. In addition to those associated with the universities and 3 penal institutions, and Bulger was in one of them, Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Senator Huddleston, was there any evidence or any indication that there were other motives that the agency, CIA, might also be looking for drugs that could be applied for other purposes, such as debilitating an individual or even killing another person? Was this part of this kind of experimentation? Admiral Turner, yes, I think there is. I have not seen in this series of documentation evidence of desire to kill, but I think the project turned its character from a defensive to an offensive one as it went along, and there certainly was an intention here to develop drugs that could be of use. Senator Kennedy. The records reveal a far more extensive series of experiments than any had previously been thought. 86 universities or institutions were involved. New instances of unethical behavior were revealed. The intelligence community of this nation, which requires a shroud of secrecy in order to operate, has a very sacred trust from the American people. The CIA's program of human experimentation of the 50s and 60s violated that trust. It was violated again on the day the bulk of the agency's records were destroyed in 1973. It is violated each time a responsible official refuses to recollect the details of the program. The best safeguard against abuses in the future is a complete public accounting of the abuses of the past. Before MK Ultra, a picture of Jim Bulger, age 24. You recognize that name of that guy over there? He was an undergrad at Harvard. His parents, he started Harvard at 16. If you don't recognize him, the Unabomber, yes. His brother told me, I've been in touch with his brother David, that his parents were asked to sign a paper when Ted was 17 to take part in a study. Of course, the parents weren't told the truth about what the study was. It was MK Ultra. Was Bulger a monster? If so, was this monster created? He said he remembered being hooked up to that big machine and they would ask him questions. Have you ever killed anyone? Would you ever kill anyone? This is Bulger again. Oh, I'm sorry. Ooh, I let that one out of the bag. This is Bulger again before MK Ultra. This is him when he was released from Atlanta to go to Alcatraz. Look at, he loved Alcatraz. He had nothing but wonderful things to say about Alcatraz. It freed him from MK Ultra. A book just came out. Do you recognize this guy? Book came out a few weeks ago by Tom O'Neill. He was a journalist back when Manson was active and has followed the story all these years and just came out with the book. And he's tying the CIA to Manson. The CIA was doing some of their LSD experiments in San Francisco to wanderers and prostitutes, and Manson was there at that time. Now we'll go into this. Okay, and leaving that one, how many others, folks? We can't even say for sure, but we can't say it didn't happen. Okay? How many others? Never mind people that became murderers, the families that were absolutely destroyed by this. There were supposed to also have been, the CIA admitted, but we don't know if they're telling us the truth or not, that 1,000 military personnel were involved in those experiments as well. My son is an officer in the Navy. It's hard to sleep at night, let me tell you. Okay, Bulger's deteriorating health. I wrote to Jim Bulger for 5 years. I have 77 letters from him. In those letters, he frequently talked about his health. I went to visit him 3 times in prison. I spent 15 hours with him face to face. I am a nurse. I saw his legs. Poor circulation, edema, sometimes weeping edema. He was bound to a wheelchair because during the hallucinations early on while he was in prison, he would fall out of the bed and he hurt his hip. They never even bothered to take an x-ray of his hip for 3 months, and by that time the damage was done. He couldn't walk, okay? He was 89 years old, folks. Now, he needed surgery for the heart. He needed surgery for the hips. And he wasn't going to get any younger. He knew, he anticipated being transferred to a medical federal prison. For 8 months he was anticipating it. Catherine Gregg wrote to me on October 18th and said that Jim's on his way, and how she was relieved, happy to hear that. 8 heart attacks, did I mention that? He had already? So he was transferred to a place in Oklahoma. It is a federal transfer station. Prisoners go there and then they're sent out from there to where they're going ultimately. The plan was he was going to go to the medical facility. Then lo and behold, it's announced that his health had suddenly improved. It was a lie. It couldn't improve. So he was sent to Hazleton, United States Penitentiary in West Virginia. He was dead within 12 hours. There was no protection, a high-profile criminal. Somebody also tried to kill him when he was in Florida, he told me. You know, they get a name for themselves if they can take down somebody that's high-profile. We're told he was unrecognizable. The beating was carried out in part with a padlock stuffed sock. His eyes appeared to have been dislodged from his head. I have also heard that they attempted to cut out his tongue. This man was seen going into Bulger's cell. He's a mafia hitman from Massachusetts. There are 2 others as well. There have been no charges filed as of yet. They have them on camera going into his cell, okay? Now I look at this guy and I think, you know, he's in prison for life, mafia. He thought he was doing the right thing by their code. Bulger was an FBI informant. He helped the FBI take down the mafia. This guy was doing a heroic thing if you're a mafia hitman. But what if Bulger wasn't an FBI informant? Do others bear responsibility for Bulger's murder? Steve Fleming. He had close ties to the mafia. He admitted to being an FBI informant. He created the map of the induction room for the FBI. John Morris, he ran and told the Boston Globe Bulger was an FBI informant, so the mafia would murder Bulger. Because, you know, I didn't tell you this. Morris came to Bulger and asked him to kill his wife, who was going to divorce him. And Bulger said no. The wife knew that this guy had more money than he should have. They entertained organized crime figures, her and her children. Puts a different spin on guess who's coming to dinner, doesn't it? Okay? And he knew that his wife would confess all this, and when they got through the divorce and all the financial stuff, it would come out. John Connolly also claimed to be Bulger's handler. John Connolly just needs to come out and say it wasn't so, and think how that would change the whole Bulger story. And even more, do these guys bear some responsibility? Dick Lear and Gerard O'Neill, who wrote Black Mass based on John Morris's statement that Bulger was an informant. The Boston Globe for allowing that to be printed without checking it out more thoroughly. It's absolutely insane to think an FBI agent is going to tell you who their informants are. It's absolutely unethical. Why did the Boston Globe print that story so readily? And Fred Wyshak, giving all these deals, these outrageous, immoral deals to serial killers. Now, in the scales of justice, I have tried to imagine it, folks, okay? I keep trying to imagine this. All the crimes and the murders of Martorano, Fleming, Weeks, Patney, John Morris weigh less than the crimes of Jim Bulger? How does that work? Between those 5 individuals that got their freedom, over 100 people were killed. How does that work? And why? Why did they want Bulger so desperately? Who planned his murder? How far up the federal chain of command did it go? And why? Dead men don't talk, or do they? Jim Bulger came to the realization that MK Ultra did a lot more to him than he realized. I asked him once face to face, Jim, did it change you? He said, you know it changed me, I hallucinate. I said, Jim, did it change you? And he hesitated and he looked around the room and he looked back and he said, yes, it changed me. He was writing to over 100 people worldwide from prison, and he was talking about MK Ultra. Is justice dead in America? People ask me why I do this. It's because I wrote the books on the American Revolution. It's because I know our founding fathers established as one of the founding pillars of this nation a just and fair judicial system because Great Britain was taking advantage of them in the courts. That pillar is crumbling. And when that pillar goes, folks, make no mistake about it, this country goes. Hard cases make bad law. And people say, why are you defending Bulger? Well, why not? Because if they can do it to him, make no mistake about it, they can do it to you and me. Do you see all the innocence projects popping up nationwide? I talked to 2 editors from 60 Minutes. They came out to do an informal interview. And one of the producers told me that when they did the previous stories on Bulger, they just accepted what the FBI showed them and what the Boston U.S. Attorney showed them. They just accepted it. So we don't do that anymore because we're finding out innocent people all over this country have been thrown in prison for decades. Things have to change, and hopefully they will. Any questions, comments, tomatoes?